I, like many of you I'm sure, have a special place in my heart for the Age of Empires series. Its debut entry was the first RTS I ever played, and the sequel captured my attention for an incalculable number of hours throughout my childhood, and still does even to this day. But despite how much Age of Empires 2 I played, it could never replace the wonderful memories I had playing the first, despite how much of a better game it might be. So you can imagine my elation a couple of years back when we first heard wind of the upcoming Definitive Edition, which promised to grace our screens with its historical battles once again, all through the lens of modern graphics, audio and effects. And in February of 2018, it did mostly, but we'll get to that. As I'm sure you've all heard of, the upcoming Definitive Edition remake of Age of Empires 2 is now due out later sometime this year, which will be Microsoft's second attempt at bringing that game into the modern era, with the first being the HD edition back in 2013. And despite some initial bumps in the road, it's turned out to be probably the best way to play Age of Empires 2 in the modern day, and it's even received some exclusive new expansions since its re-release. And while I'm of course excited about the prospect of having a better version of the game I love to play already, I've got to admit, I'm cautiously optimistic, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is probably the most obvious, which is how the original Age of Empires Definitive Edition turned out, and the second is all the pre-release material I've seen for it so far, which after review has left me with quite a few questions and a couple of concerns. So let's start with the former. When Age of Empires Definitive Edition was poised to come out at the beginning of last year, I was fairly excited. Despite having put many more hours into its sequel, the feeling of nostalgia I got when playing it persisted, so Microsoft's promise of modernised graphics and gameplay was something I was very intrigued with. However, when it did finally arrive on my computer screen, I was left with a bit of a sour taste after playing for a few hours. And I'm sure some of you who have played it can agree with me here, but things just felt off, wrong, not quite right. And these feelings stick with me even today as I'm playing it for this video. While it could be that the game is just straight up not as good as I remember it, which to a degree is probably likely, I think it's actually a collection of things that weren't handled or executed on right, and most of them stem from the game's visuals. While at a glance they do look quite good and are clearly true to the original, once I played it for a while I began to notice little things, like how the ground textures look kind of blurry, or how the buildings have this little haze effect to them, how the units seem just a wee bit too big, or how unit animations have this tiny gap in between them that just makes them look a bit odd when compared to the original. Some of you might call this nitpicking, and that's cool, I get that, it kind of is, but I feel like it's justified when something is being marketed as a definitive edition. And these, along with the game's sweeping graphical overhauls, make it feel like it's lost a piece of its soul in its transition to the modern era. But that's not to say everything's like this, of course. The gameplay is still classic Age of Empires, which is exactly what I wanted. And it even comes with a few nice upgrades too, like being able to order new farms, attack move units, and edit UI elements to your liking. Unfortunately, there are still a few nasties left over from the original game, like the atrocious unit pathfinding, and the fact that the campaigns have no real cutscenes or much degree of a story, except for some bland voiceovers at either end. One thing I did love about the Definitive Edition, however, was its sound design of all things, which I think is my favourite part of the entire new version. Everything's really crisp and high quality, from everything to arrow impacts and sword clashes. And the soundtrack is also just how I remember it, except it actually sounds way better in comparison to the original. Hearing those tracks took me right back to my early gaming years, probably unlike anything ever really could. Now lastly, I want to briefly cover the game's performance, as that's been a talking point for a lot of people. For a remaster of a game that came out over 20 years ago, I found it leaves a bit to be desired. Scrolling across the map was often pretty choppy, and when there's a lot going on and you're fully zoomed out, my FPS would actually drop quite significantly, though not to unplayable levels or anything. It really just felt a bit unoptimized, because most of the time it actually runs pretty well, it's for me at least. So now that I've covered my overall thoughts on the first game's definitive edition, let's talk about the upcoming version of Age of Empires 2 and my impressions of the promotional content and pre-release gameplay. And now, before anyone asks, no, I do not have a beta key to access the Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition. Microsoft, if you're watching this, I'd love to get one, please send me an email. So like I said, these thoughts are purely based off pre-release footage. Right out of the gate, seeing the footage for the game did put my mind at ease somewhat. In my opinion, the art style of Age of Empires 2 is so iconic, I feel any remaster wouldn't hit the mark if it deviated too much. So I'm happy to see it being kept very true to the original. And from what I've seen, nearly everything seems to be sticking to that trend. All the UI elements are very recognisable with sensible upgrades, and the environments themselves look much better than they do in Age of Empires 1 Definitive, with a lot less blur and what seems like much finer details. Though there is one thing that concerns me, and that's the performance. Now yes, I hear you, I get this is pre-release footage and very much likely a beta build of the game that will most certainly have more optimization time put into it, but I do want to cover it nonetheless. A lot of times, this gameplay gets pretty choppy with very noticeable microstutters throughout, and I can't tell if it's just animations or actual FPS some of the time, but in a lot of cases the things like collapsing buildings look smooth but other elements around it don't. And I'm really hoping this kind of stuff can be ironed out before the full release later this year, because I don't know about you guys, but things like this really take me out of a game experience. But overall, I'm very optimistic. From what I've seen and heard from the developers, I'm confident they're doing their best to stay true to the classic that we know and love, while also make changes and advancements that are hopefully going to improve all aspects of the original. And of course, give us a reason to play it over the existing HD edition. I do admit I always thought it was kinda odd that we'd have two modernized versions of Age of Empires 2 available. I guess it's good that if one falls over, there's another one to fall back on. So those are my thoughts. I haven't covered the Age of Empires 3 Definitive Edition as there's no real information about that project yet apart from that it will exist at one point, but I'll be sure to discuss it once there is. And guys, if you want to get in on the beta, then please head on over to www.ageofempires.com and sign up. Apparently everyone who applies will get in eventually, so if you're interested and want to provide feedback on the beta, then I'd encourage you to do so. I did it a while back because I want to make sure that this game can be the best it can possibly be. Hashtag not sponsored. I'd love to hear what you guys think about the definitive editions. Age of Empires is one of the most beloved RTS series of all time, so I think it would be interesting to hear everyone's opinions on if you think the re-releases are doing them justice, or you'd rather them just leave the classics alone and untouched. Sound off in the comments. And if you want to continue the discussion, then come join our community Discord. Boom, segue. We have a great group of like-minded folks over there, so come and be a part of it. Links in the description. You'll also be able to find my Twitter and Twitch channels there, so you know what to do with those. And of course, subscribe for more videos, and look out for my full review of Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition once the game has finally been released later on this year. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you all next time.